Okay. All right. Yes, hello. My name is Antti Ville Kärjä, and as Kim said, I work at this music archive, JAPA, which has nothing to do with Japanese music, if somebody wonders. It's an acronym based on the previous title of the organization of the archive, which was the Finnish Jazz and Pop Archive. So basically, it's an archive of originally of jazz music in Finland, and nowadays more maybe about popular music, but basically open to all kinds of music, in case the material is very unique and not related to Sibelius, because Sibelius Museum is taking care of Sibelius. But that's another story. Anyway, so I was asked to talk about on the basis of my ongoing project. It's been going on since the beginning of 2014. The title is Music, Multiculturality and Finland, and I'm not sure if I've encountered the formulation multiculturality basically anywhere else. So it's a kind of a neologism, which is a shortened version of the idea behind the different ways of defining multiculturalism and emphasizing the idea of cultural diversity rather than, for example, cultural policies. And through that, the idea is to focus on the kind of intersections of music and cultural diversity, cultural differences, cultural identities in the more kind of demarcated area of that is constituted by Finland. But it's also, basically you could say that I'm interested in examining how all these different concepts are kind of changing and what kind of different aspects are connected to them. So the basic questions would be on the basis of that what is music after all? What are we talking about when we are talking about music? And then cultural diversity, what is culture? What are cultures? Is there meaning? Does it mean different things when we talk about culture or the kind of cultural diversity? I'm personally in favor of the cultural rather than talking about cultures as some kind of clear-cut entities in societies. And nowadays I feel that many times culture is used as a synonym for nation or country, which is a very problematic thing. And then, of course, in the end, what is Finland? What do we talk about when we talk about Finland? And also in the idea that not only what does it mean how are the different ideas, or how is the idea of Finnishness changing, and because of this cultural diversity, cultural interaction, so forth, and especially migration, and also in broader terms that where are the limits, or what are the uses of national identities in more general, that why do we have, why is it so prevalent and maybe sometimes, well, why is it so important to talk about these differences in terms of national boundaries? I'm going to give you some background here from a more kind of theoretical point of view. One of the kind of provocations that I've been used is the notion of post-colonial Finland. Post-coloniality in general can be taken as referring to the kind of a global state of affairs that's a kind of a result of colonial period, the kind of a proper colonial period, if you wish. In general terms, you could say that the post-colonial countries proper refer to especially the countries that were dominated and governed by the British Empire in the 17th, 18th, 19th century especially. But also, and also quite a lot, this discussion has been related to the African countries that have gained their independence during the 1960s and afterwards. But the idea here is to emphasize that the colonial period was a kind of a global phenomenon, and it affected every corner of the world. And in that sense, Finland is not by any means outside of these processes. So there's a bit problem with the layout there. But anyway, this comes from this book from 2005, this quotation by Simon Featherstone, where he mentions or emphasizes the idea that it's how did the first line there go? But the idea is to delimit the discussion on those countries that have experienced colonialism, but have to whatever extent and by whatever means freed themselves from it, is only to raise other questions about historical boundaries and the usefulness of cross-historical comparisons and parallels. So basically the idea here is that while there are these certain parts of the world that were affected more concretely and more forcefully by the colonial powers, the kind of, especially the mindsets and the ideologies and the modes of thought, they were global or began to emerge or began to develop as global and affected also regions like Finland as part of the kind of a broader conceptualization of Europe, although Finland, I would say, is a kind of a good example here and a handy way of bringing out these different dynamics of the post-colonial condition, as it were, in the sense that it resides at the kind of fringe of Europe. Its part its position as part of Europe is always in a way contested. It's not the core country of Europe, and then there's of course, because of certain political events in the more recent history, there is this idea of Finland residing in some ways in between the West and the East. And of course nowadays there is an interesting strand of studies emerging, or there is this discussion about the northern dimension also, in the sense that we are not only talking about the so-called global South and it's kind of the issues that are related to it and the migration that comes from there, but also the kind of, well, the term that people have been used is borealism, meaning it refers to the idea that how the North may be exoticized and used, for example, in contemporary days in various ways, for example, in tourism industry, as a way of marketing the North as an exotic area in its kind of own right. And how does this build on also the kind of pretty much the same ideas and modes of thought that exoticize the North and then separate the northern people, and especially this becomes a very kind of a delicate matter when we talk about the indigenous population in the very north, the Sami people. That how is the indigeneity constructed also as an exotic identity, and through that it kind of maintains the age-old or the older kind of ideas of the ethnic other being somehow different from the of course there are issues of difference that you can't deny the difference, but the difference is then conceptualized in a different way. The kind of three core topics that include Simon Featherstone mentions as the core topics of this post-colonial inquiry deal with the question of nationhood, or as I mentioned, that this idea that much of the world is organized on the basis of nations or states rather, but in many cases the states are dealt also as nation states, and then within the states or countries there is a lot of talk about what kind of nations comprise the country in question, and how these borderlines of the nations are always kind of fluid, porous, and then this leads to questions of hybrid cultural identities, and this links directly to issues of migration, that how when people come from different parts of the world, how do their kind of the old, let's say the old home country identity, how does it come into the new country, and how these identities then might form new forms of identity. And basically the underlying idea is that when we examine this closely enough, we can find that all identities, all these cultural identities and national identities are almost by definition hybrid to begin with, so that we can find always different kind of distinctions made there, and different kind of histories which kind of prove time after time that the kind of search for this kind of somehow authentic, unified cultural identity is a futile endeavor. The other one is also linked directly to migration and the question of diasporic communities. Diaspora here means, or refers to the idea when people move around the world, and especially move from one place to another and then settle there, and how they maintain their links to the place where they came from, and how also when people from one place move to different places and multiple places, how they create these kind of diasporic networks, and then how then the kind of a cultural identity that becomes constructed is dependent on those networks, and through that the identity construction process becomes multi-sided. There are people living literally all around the world, but somehow representing the same kind of cultural identities, and then the particular localities also affect the ways in which the allegedly let us say that we would talk about the African diaspora in Finland, that then what parts of Africa are we talking about, and also then how do the nations come into the picture? Are there any significant differences between let's say Western African populations in Finland and elsewhere in the country, elsewhere in the world, and also Southern African populations and groups and so forth? That how do these categories interrelate, and how do the people then who belong to these different groups, how do they maintain their connections to the African locations, and also the other locations where people from the same region may be living in different parts of the world. And then the third one is related to the history. It's a historiographical question, meaning that there is a tendency to it's related to the idea that historiography, writing a history for a certain cultural phenomenon like music or any other form of cultural activity, is a very strong legitimizing activity. That basically you could say that it strengthens the kind of existence of a certain phenomenon. One example here could be the notion of Finnish music, that how the history of Finnish music was in a sense manufactured or written and then became carved into the stone as a metaphorical expression through these historiographical writings and presentations, and that creates also, it sort of maintains, it creates the history in a sense, although it can of course be said that there is certain empirical evidence behind it, and then it relies on certain cultural practices that are in a sense real, but still there is a strong kind of a value judgment and value assignment being made all the time when these histories are written. There is certain things that are excluded from them, certain things that are emphasized in them, and through that the history is always kind of a political construction, and it reflects certain values in the society and so forth. And in that sense it would be interesting. I will actually come to this soon enough, but the way in which, for example, the history of popular music in Finland has been constructed, and then how does this affect the kind of what is its relation to the current flows of migration, processes of migration, is a kind of one interesting part of it's one part that I'm interested in this whole set of questions. But yes, to go forward with the idea of post-colonial Finland, that it means recognizing also Finland as not only a geographical location, but also a temporal, historical location. Temporal meaning here not temporal in the sense that you could say that it's nations are always temporal, that they come established at one point of time and then they vanish at one point of time. We do not know yet when Finland will vanish, but it will. And it wasn't here 2,000 years ago, let's put it more dramatically. It wasn't here 20,000 years ago, and it's highly unlikely that it will be here 20,000 years from now. But anyway, so from a bit more shorter time span in mind, here are some kind of trajectories that affect the idea or are behind the idea of post-colonial Finland. So that we have this kind of axis of power or directions of influence in different ages and different times coming from different places. So here I'm basically referring to the idea in very broad and very broad and general sweeps here, that before the 19th century, the kind of main influence was pretty much coming from in terms of this kind of colonial relations, coming from Sweden, coming from the West, because Finland in the kind of contemporary conceptualization was part of the Swedish kingdom. So Finland was part of Sweden. And then in the 19th century, and also before 19th century, and especially during the 19th century, the influence is coming from Russia, because Finland was then part of the Russian Empire. The kind of this kind of political, especially political, but also cultural influence was very strong from there, you could say. And also the Central European influences were very strong. That's the 19C dash there, just roughly above Germany. And then another kind of influential axis is the line of influence is the post World War II cultural dominance of the United States. So that at one point, and this, well, you could say in some ways or sometimes people define right when they deal with Finnish history, that 1952 when Helsinki hosted the Olympic Games, that was the kind of a decisive moment. That after that Finland became very soon one of the most Americanized nations or countries in whole Europe, and that was also when Coca-Cola was introduced in the country, and then various other stuff, and then also in the realm of music, of course, you could say that after that well, also before that, but also after that, the kind of American or the United States cultural output has been very dominant in the country. But then also that there are these trajectories that are more expansive in the sense that, and here, especially if we think about the 1930s, that we can pick out the kind of a tension between this kind of a very delicate relationship between the mainstream Finnish population and the Sami population in the north, and how Finland, or the establishment of Finnish society, basically practiced or utilized colonial practices towards the Sami population. They were forcibly educated, and then young people were separated from their families because of this, and so forth. And also that they were, for many of them, it wasn't possible. It was basically denied to use Sami language in public occasions and so forth. So there was kind of very strong unifying procedures taken at that time. But before that, in the late 19th century, there was also the missionary work towards southern parts of Africa began to develop, and especially the Ovambo area in northern Namibia is the kind of central place for this missionary work. And at one point, soon after the independence in 1918, 1919, there were some people in rather high positions in the society who actually developed or made a proposition that the state should obtain the area as an official colony for Finland when it had become free from the German rule, because of Germany lost the World War I. So that there were these certain attempts to create certain kind of official colonialism also in Finland, and that's a kind of an indication or just an example of the ways in which the let's say the missionary work in this case is closely connected to the broader colonial endeavors that took place in the world, and Finland was by no means separated from those. But that also is linked to the musical issues because of the kind of peculiar position of Africa especially in the kind of a imagination of popular music, and how different styles of popular music are constructed, and the question of blackness in music, black music as a category, how they are also have been very influential for the Finnish way of thinking and conceptualizing and so forth. To continue with another map, and then this historiographical historiographical issue. One kind of crucial figure in the field of Finnish historiography into popular music, Pekka Jalkanen. This is now we're talking about stuff that he wrote already in the early 90s, and basically you could say that these ideas are based on the situation in the 80s. So it's an interesting thing, and one thing that interests me here greatly is that how this situation might have changed during the past 30 years or so. That we are talking about situation or kind of a generalization of a situation 30 years ago, and if we kind of relate this to the more contemporary questions of migration, that are there anything that might have changed crucially? But anyway, his idea here is that Finnish popular music particularly is comprised of these three major traditions that he calls the mother traditions. And one of them would be the kind of a Eastern European / Karelian folk music. Then the second one would be the Central European classical repertoire. And then these are also in the sense kind of historical, that the folk music dimension there goes back several centuries, and with the classical repertoire we are talking about music that's roughly coming from the past 300 or 400 years. And then the third one would be this what he labeled Afro-American tradition of Finnish popular music, and that would be the kind of the 20th century consequence of musical development. So the question in that sense is that, well, how is this still a valid way of approaching different styles and genres and types of music that is made in Finland, and especially when it's made by people who have a more recent migrant history? That these would be the kind of a core. Well, if we pick any artist from the 80s, let's say these quintessential figures of Suomi rock, for example, like Juuse Leskinen or Eppu Normaali, how do they fit in here? And now, if we go there anywhere in the country and take, let's take, Cheek doesn't have this kind of migrant background, but still a rapper like him, a contemporary rapper like him, that how could he be labeled or situated in this kind of a framework? But then if we took a kind of a different rapper, let's say a person like Brasias, who comes from Congo, raps in English here in Finland, how would he be his kind of a repertoire would be situated here? Is there a link to the Finnish folk side there? Would there be a kind of is it stronger or weaker than in the case of Cheek? Is it stronger than weaker in the case of Eppu Normaali or Juuse Leskinen and those figures? So this is kind of a thing that I'm still continuously kind of trying to figure out, that how this framework of traditions, is it this kind of a stranglehold on the expectations that are put on certain types of music, and how do people with more recent migrant background, and especially if their musical styles are based on let's say the kind of a Middle Eastern or Eastern African styles, that how they would they be more or less excluded from this idea of somehow Finnish music, and how much work and kind of intellectual labor would it mean, and conceptual labor in the broader community it would mean to start thinking about those music also as one possible this kind of mother traditions, or the kind of a provocative question that I have in mind here is that how long does it take, for example, for the North African Rai music to become one of the mother traditions of Finnish music? So are we talking about is it a ludicrous question, or what kind of processes have to take place before that could happen? Well, it's a provocation of sorts. Just to bring out also some general issues that are linked to the question of music and migration. There is this, well, I'm not sure if it's, in scholarly terms, it's still a recent book. It was released in 2011, so I'm not sure if it's a very new one or not, but still, it was released in 2011. Migrating Music, there are several chapters on different aspects there. But there, in the introduction, the editors, they bring out, this is a kind of useful 4 M's to remember when talking about music and migration. So we have 2 already there, but still 4 more. So one of them is musicians. So it's one thing to talk about the physical movement, physical migration of people from one place to another, and how this changes things, and what kind of interactions it enables, and what kind of processes are involved. And then mimesis or mimesis, how do you say it in English? I'm not quite sure. But anyway, a Greek term referring to the kind of imitating activity. And here, 2 crucial processes are how these new styles that bring, for example, that come into a cultural location, how they become copied, and then gradually how they enter these kind of translational processes. It's not just about translating words into from another language to another, or from one language to another, but also the kind of broader idea of translation, that when this new musical phenomenon enters a new cultural condition, that also the kind of not just the verbal content, but also the musical aspects of it become a subject to these translational aspects, that the music itself, and then also the kind of visual symbolics there, and the behavioral modes, that they become more nuanced and take part in this kind of a translational processes, and through that we can also say that, well, if we take the example of Suomi rock, that it was a process of this kind of a very slow translation that involved the linguistic part, but also the way in which certain styles were amalgamated and combined to each other, and then also transformed during the process. And then, very crucially, in contemporary times, the mediation aspect, so that when we are talking about this music and migration, or music and migration in broader terms, well, the physical migration is one thing, and it's a very, very kind of, well, it's a very concrete thing for many people. It's the process through which people actually come to interact with each other in the very, very, very intimate and human ways. But it's also very crucial to note that nowadays, especially, everything already, in a sense, exists in the media, and then it's basically accessible through media, and the digital media especially, and the social networks that are created through that. So that, and that's linked also to the idea of how these diasporic connections are maintained, and they become in a way more, well, in some ways more efficient, but also there is this the speediness and the quickness of those connections, and the immediateness. It also runs the risk that the kind of a more slower processes are not maybe recognized clearly enough. But nevertheless, the idea is here, and sometimes I've been using these examples in Finland, like the Suomi rock case, and also we could talk about the contemporary rap scene in pretty much the same way, and the kind of rock and roll phase in the 50s and 60s. Also, that, well, it took 10 years before, or the kind of the phenomenon itself, let's say rock music or rock and roll or rap music, it was introduced in a certain point of time, and then 10 years later, the kind of Finnish version, it starts emerging. So the first phase it's a kind of a representation brought in by the media as a kind of a something strange that comes from other places. It's a new strange style of music, and then gradually, during the 10-year period, it becomes it becomes appropriated and translated and modified in the kind of local settings, and then it emerges, in a sense, re-emerges as a distinctively national genre. But then again, in these cases, you could say that the physical migration is pretty much it's a minimal aspect of this. And then well, in the case of rap music, for example, it was interesting. It was also around the year 2010 when in Finland people started talking about, because of certain people with immigrant background who became kind of prominent rappers and got recording deals and so forth and became public figures, that people started here talking about the immigrant rappers or migrant rappers here in Finland, referring all these people were all three young males coming from African countries, performing in English, and then there was this kind of a distinction made, a new category of Finnish rap created for them. I'm not sure if it was very kind of a long-standing category, but still that they were distinctively labeled as migrants, and this kind of type of rapping was labeled also as migrant rap or immigrant rap. And then the question is how language and their ethnicity comes into that picture. It makes it rather complicated issue. But the first M here is modulation, or well, they use the word modulation. You can find different ways of formulating this as well, and it's linked in some ways to this translation idea. But anyway, this process is dynamic, fluid. The borders are fluid. There's always this kind of a transformations taking place, and gradually, especially through time, the practices change inevitably. There's a rather interesting book on Bhangra genre, and from both Indian perspective and London or the British perspective, called Bhangra Moves, and there the author uses the word mutation, which is also kind of a interesting way of putting this, and a certain kind of a association created through the kind of evolutionary projects or evolutionary processes that take place in society and in culture and in more general, and how everything is basically in a state of mutation all the time. And it's a kind of it doesn't mean that the Bhangra would by any means be a mutant in the kind of a negative sci-fi sense, but it's the idea of emphasizing these positive aspects of mutation, that everything changes, and it's inevitable, and then one needs to sort of think about it more carefully. Okay, so was the idea to have some discussion after my talk here as well?
We can have a little bit of discussion afterwards.
So now I plan to go into the examples that I've been working on, or the kind of cases for the past two years, and in some ways longer than that. One of them, so these are in a way, I bring this up in order to highlight also the kind of a different layers and different aspects that are involved here, and they also are here now in a sort of chronological order or maybe historical order, or the historical consciousness is something that explains this order of them. But one of my cases is this, what I've been doing with the Finnish community in New Zealand, or Aotearoa, New Zealand. Aotearoa is the Maori word for the place, and New Zealand is the English name for the place, but you know the geographical location. But anyway, the one example there is the folk dancing or tanhu practice that the Auckland Finnish Society, which is the Finnish society in Auckland, they maintain still. They've been doing this, or it started elsewhere, but since the 1970s, the main place has been Auckland, the biggest city of the country, and where most of the Finnish people with Finnish background are living. And this society has been performing these dances since the 50s, when the kind of Finnish community was established there. So this is a kind of a migrant community that has roots in the 50s and in the 60s in terms of when we think about their travels to Finland or travel from Finland to New Zealand. So here's a video clip. From one performance in 2011. Do you have sound?
Got 3 dances all together. The first one is their version of an Israeli dance, which they use it as a warm-up. And the second one is from Kärjä, southeast of Finland, on the border between Finland and Russia. Usually from these areas, there is a greeting between the dancers before the dance starts proper. And then the third one is a celebration on the back of a sheep, and that's all tripping over the ropes. And the last one is from southeast Finland. Please enjoy the show and enjoy the short sample of dances from Finland. Please put your hands together.
Well, I don't know. Does this example raise any issues with you or ideas? What are we dealing with when we are dealing with this kind of phenomenon?
Is this supposed to represent Finland today?
Well, that is a pertinent question, and in the way in which they stage it as they represent Finland there on that stage on that day. So basically, you could say that it represents certain type of Finnishness at least. But yeah, the question is that what kind of Finnishness does it? But maybe are you saying that it doesn't represent the Finland of today?
I don't know how to dance like that, but I'm from Finland.
Okay. Anybody here familiar with Finnish folk dancing in more detail? Any other ideas about the way in which they dance there? Is this kind of a, yep?
I was thinking about music, I think it's from radio side.
Well, they say in the introduction, it was probably, you didn't hear it when because we didn't have the sound on there, but they say that they have an Israeli dance. Israeli dance, which they use for a warm-up. And then but the whole kind of a grip that they have here, what they call the what is it? Grapevine grip is very, very rare in Finnish folk dancing in general, but it comes from the more Mediterranean region. And the whole kind of way in which they go back and forth in this half circle, it's not the most typical way of dancing Finnish folk dances. So that when I was there and I started watching, well, first of all starting with the guy who comes there with a Finnish flag and wearing Sami outfit, then that was a bit of a shock for me. And then when I later asked about this, that they were saying, oh, okay, yeah, we were thinking about that, but we thought that increase the kind of colorfulness of the performance, and then bring out also the different national costumes. And then, okay, well, Sami people might not think of it as a national costume after all, and also as I don't know if you followed the discussion fairly recently here, but the Sami costume is a very heated debate. There's a very heated debate around that at the time now, today, in the country, and the way in which it might have been appropriated or different kind of inappropriate ways of using it in different, let's say, art pieces of art and so forth. And also here that, well, does the kind of a geographical distance, and also maybe the kind of in a way the imagined historical distance, how they are at play in this situation, and how they become kind of these alleviative aspects that make the use of these very contested symbols more, in a sense, allowable. And I have the impression that they actually haven't been using the outfit after this situation, because I started asking these difficult questions and so forth. But anyway, but still that these national symbols are there and tied to this particular way of dancing when well, in a closer inspection isn't really the Finnish dancing, or the kind of a most traditional way of, or the most canonized way of Finnish dancing. So that there are these issues of hybrid identities here, I would say, clearly present. That how do these different influences and ideas of national identity, and also the kind of a more maybe broader this kind of folk cultural identity, how they become intertwined in these ways that might create actually some tensions. And then one of them was saying that yes, if there had been a Lappish person in the audience, he or she might have been offended by this use of this. And actually, the leader of this group also told me in an interview that she was a bit wary about the use of this dance as a first number, because there might be some Israeli people there. So she was clearly also concerned that there is something not totally all right if we use this dance and as a representation of Finnishness on stage. So that there were just these tensions there. But of course, then they have the kind of a national costumes there, which are pretty much authentic, or follow the kind of a code that's labeled as authentic and kind of official, so that you have that certain regional types of costumes there that can be pinpointed that these costumes represent this certain region in the country, which is also a signal of this hybridity or the diversity of these kind of a cultural identifications in Finland itself. That it's not just about Finnishness here, or this the bluish costume in the middle. That's the so-called Suomi costume, which it's supposed to be representing the whole country. But then it doesn't have the kind of official status of national costume, and it's supposed to be used only when abroad. And then the other ones, they represent Ostrobothnia, eastern parts of the country, Viipuri Viipuri region, and where was the other one? One of them was anyway. They have these very distinctive regions that they sort of point to, and then the question, of course, would be that how well are these all kind of equal as parts of Finnishness, and how do the regional differences there? How if we approach Finnishness in this kind of a context through those regional differences, what kind of tensions or kind of dynamics might be expectable and so forth. But also these temporal dimensions are significant here, because the type of dancing that they do is actually based on a guidebook or this manual of folk dances that comes from 1930s. So that you could say that there is this very, very strong, in a sense, the music becomes museumified, or the dancing becomes museumified. Well, it's sort of represented as a living museum, and it sort of stages these age-old, or not, well, let's say 80-year-old practices still as a kind of a valid representation of Finnishness. But they were also kind of conscious about this and they were in a sense saying that they want to keep these certain traditions alive, and also made a juxtaposition when there was a contemporary folk dancing group from Finland visiting New Zealand in late 2000, it was around 2008, 2009, that they were saying, well, their dancing is totally different from ours, so that there is, but still that this is kind of it's not an isolated example. It's been noted elsewhere too that there is this kind of that the tradition become not petrified, but still that they become there is this what's the word, jähmettyä, stagnation, stagnated to some extent because of this temporal distance, and also the geographical distance to the old home country, that they kind of, and that involves also some nostalgic aspects and so forth. How much do I have now?
5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. Well, maybe
Depends on
shorter
we can
examples.
take the discussion then later on.
Yeah. All right. The other example is linked to this. One band in New Zealand called Finn Express. My initial, when I started this work, I first became kind of acquainted, and the information that I was able to get was pointing towards this folk dancing stuff. And then there was this one book, a local history of this certain place, and then another book on the kind of a broader history or general history of Finnish migration to New Zealand, where this one picture was reproduced, the one there on your left, where it was said that this is an old Finnish band from early 1960s. And then, well, I asked about this about certain people, that there are these references to this band, that do you remember it, or how were they, what kind of music did they play? And they were performing quite a lot, and they were rather good, and the guys are living still there somewhere. And then after a while I managed to get in contact with the guys, and then turned out that the band was actually existing for more than 10 years in this certain region, so that it wasn't just an early Finnish band from the early 1960s, but it was a band called Finn Express that enjoyed rather broad regional success there from the late 60s to early 80s. So that they were performing gradually or performing regularly, at least basically every week, once every week there for 15 years or so. And this then was the kind of later stages picture here from 1977, which kind of tells you how they looked at the heyday of their success, when they were known as Finn Express. They weren't known as Finn Express at the time of the first picture there, but still, but there was a bigger history, kind of bigger, stronger, longer history, and much more active history behind the band than I expected. And I started wondering, why is this represented then in the history books, or these two books that are kind of historically oriented? Why is it represented as this early Finnish band from the 1960s? And then also this ideas that does the first picture kind of signal somehow stronger links to the traditional ideas of Finnishness than the latter one? And also there are issues of repertoire that at this stage they said that, well, they were, every time they would play one or two Finnish songs, and the leading member of the group, the accordionist, he said that he used to sing this Irvin Goodman song, boing 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 boing, and it was a huge hit in the New Zealand audience, because everybody could understand boing boing boing, but nobody could understand the rest of the words. But still, there was this exoticism involved, but still the kind of in a sense, popular accessibility there as well. But then that they drew their repertoire in more general, and the success was based on covers of the contemporary pop songs, like this one. was copied from the repertoire of Engelbert Humperdinck, who was the kind of one of the main kind of leading pop stars of the late 60s in the UK. But the thing that here that interests me most is this kind of equation or the lines of influences and the trajectories between the local identity that in the local context, in terms of this very local small place in the middle of the North Island of New Zealand, where the most of the people lived, that the folk dancing was it was the kind of a national symbol for the community. And then later on, if you think about the Auckland Finnish society activity, folk dancing represents somehow the national. And then it's also reproduced as such in the history books, and there are a lot of, well, not a lot, but still recurrent references to it as the Finnish way of doing things. But then it's a very kind of small scale activity. It's just a group of people on a very, very geographically talking, very, 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 very small area doing things. And then when we enter this regional aspect, that there is this network of cities around this particular place in New Zealand, where this Finnish Express band started to perform, and they kind of created themselves as some sort of fame as the Finn band. They were talking about themselves as, "You are the boys in the Finn band," people told us, and so forth. And the name itself, Finn Express, so that there is this aspect of Finnishness, but still that the output is this kind of mainstream popular music mostly, with the odd Finnish Irvin Goodman song or whatever it was. But here the kind of national / folk identification is transformed into the popular kind of identification, which also makes it regional, but also that it's then somehow it becomes excluded from the historiography, which tends to emphasize or highlight the kind of more traditional ideas what Finnishness means. But yeah, it's a kind of different way of being a being a Finn in New Zealand, and also the way in which Finnishness then becomes constructed. It doesn't follow so much of the kind of most traditional symbols and emblems like the Finnish flag or so forth, the national costumes, and also the way in which there is this aspect of some maybe exoticization involved through the use of these odd songs every now and then. Okay, I see that we are now at 1 o'clock. So there were two other examples that were related to the kind of Finnish context, contemporary Finnish context that have to do with the migration too. But you can find one of them actually. The next one that I had here is related to this Our Vision singing contest that was run by the city of Helsinki, and now it's a kind of club night event series, still organized by the city of Helsinki. But there is this book called Transglobal Sounds. It's a fairly new one, came out this year. I have an article there. I can, of course, I don't know how are we going to circulate these references or the slides somehow, but
we can also do that.
But the name of the book is Transglobal Sounds, and it's a collection of essays that focus on different. It's the kind of point of departure is the generational aspects of migration in relation to musical activity. So I have there this article about the case of Our Vision singing contest in 2009, where the kind of outcome was a bit problematic in the sense that there was a kind of good intention on the part of the city of Helsinki to include everybody, but then when everybody was included, all the participants weren't happy because of that, because there were these, that there was this generational issues came out in the sense that they decided to include also the more traditional minorities such as Roma and Sami into there weren't any Sami performers, but there was this one Roma group who eventually won the competition, and then the people with more recent migrant background were quite upset because of this, and then they felt that the recording company that was involved, that there were economic interests and so things like that affected the situation. So that article is dealing with that kind of controversy that was there. There was a kind of a good intention, but it sort of backfired then in the end, and it's just an indication that maybe they in the city they weren't careful enough with the generational differences and tensions that are there when we are talking about how people with migrant background try to make their living in this field of music and try to make music seriously in Finland, and how the city of Helsinki as a kind of multicultural agent then tries to help them, but in this case, well, the help was kind of questionable. All right, so yes, now I thank you. Do we take any questions or comments at this point? Or
I think we're gonna take the questions in the end and get through. I hope that if you have any questions that you write them down and save them for later on. I think this was an excellent start to this session. Thank you very much, Antti Ville.